Hello there, and welcome to the Time Machine with Trish and Mike. I'm Mike.
I'm Trish.
And we're glad you're with us for today's adventure. How are you doing today, Trish?
I'm doing good. Welcome to our third, going into fourth week of January.
Yes, and
we made it.
It is. It's hard to believe, but we're closer to the end of January than the beginning of January.
Yes, that is a positive thing.
Which means we are almost 1/12 of the way through the year that is 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Or if some people are counting, the 13th month of 2020. I don't know. It just feels that way sometimes.
It does feel that way. We had such high hopes, but hey, we can turn it around. It's still early in the year.
There's still 11 months left. We have plenty to be optimistic about.
Positive thinking. We will attract what we desire.
That's right. Speaking of positive thinking, a huge thank you to Amber for our new show art that you have seen by now. If you're listening to our podcast, you see Trish and me in the time machine.
Mm-hmm.
And want to give a big shout out to Amber. And you can find her on Instagram at Kohaku_dragon. That's at KOHAKU_dragon. She was lovely enough to draw that wonderful art for us. And so if you're looking to get anything commissioned, by all means, please reach out to her and tell her that the Time Machine sent you there.
It's pretty darn cute. I love it.
Well, something else that people love, especially back in the 80s and 90s, was pro wrestling. And on January 24th, 1984, Hulk Hogan won his first WWF World Heavyweight Championship. And there's a whole backstory to the name Hulk Hogan that a lot of you probably don't know.
I was fascinated when you brought this story up. I couldn't believe it. And I grew up with two older brothers who loved wrestling, so I'm very familiar. But hearing the inside facts regarding the name and the whole situation is very interesting. So let us know, Mike. What did you find out?
Okay then, Trish. I will tell you what I found. See, because we've now heard the name Hulk Hogan so many times that a lot of people just instantly who it is. But back when he originally debuted in the WWF, which is a whole another interesting topic we can get into, how they transitioned from WWF to WWE, as most people know them as now. Back in 1979, he was known as the Incredible Hulk Hogan. And, well, eventually Marvel Comics caught wind of this name, and they were like, hey, yeah, about that whole Incredible Hulk stuff.
I don't know if you know this, but
we need to have a conversation. But, to their credit, Marvel Comics and the WWF were pretty cool. They were able to work out a very unique deal. WWF could not trademark the name Hulk Hogan because Marvel owned the rights to using Hulk as a character in, comic books and TV and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So they worked out an agreement. Marvel actually owned the license to Hulk Hogan, Hulkamania, and the Hulkster, and WWF licensed it through Marvel.
Okay, so they had to come to this agreement on all three names?
Yes, they came to an agreement on all three names. In fact, if you go back to any WWF show from the 80s, at the bottom in the copyright, you'll see a credit to Marvel Comics, registered trademark Hulk Hogan, the Hulkster, Hulkamania, all that are registered trademarks of Marvel Comics.
See, that's so interesting. So then what was the actual contract? Like, what did Marvel get, from Hulk Hogan?
Money. That's what they got.
Always nice. Always a good thing.
If you're ever in a contract situation, money is usually going to make one of the parties happy. And
okay, well, how much money?
Well, we're going to get into that. So they came to an agreement in 1985. Interestingly enough, they actually signed the contract a week before the first WrestleMania.
Oh, okay. So they were setting it up for his win almost,
Right. Well, he was already champion at that point. So Hulk wins the title in January of 84. Okay. The first WrestleMania is March of 85.
Okay, now I get the timeline.
So
Okay.
so it's like he was there for a while, then he went off back to the AWA in Minnesota for a couple of years, then they came back when Vincent Kennedy McMahon, who is the Vince McMahon that you know, took
Mhm.
over from his father.
Okay, okay.
So that's a whole the whole history of the WWEF, WWWF, depending how far back you want to go, can be interesting. Maybe we'll get into one day. So when Vincent Kennedy McMahon, the Vince McMahon that most people listening to this know,
Mhm.
when he took over, that's when he blew up wrestling into a big national thing as opposed to a regional thing, and that's how WrestleMania came to be, so on and so forth. So, as part of the deal with Marvel Comics, they retroactively dated it to July of 1984. The agreement was in place for 20 years or until Terry Bollea, which is Hulk's real name, ceases to be involved in wrestling. Some of the clauses in the contract included that if they used the word Hulk, they had to use the word Hogan. So you couldn't just say Hulk. You had to call him Hulk
Okay.
Hogan, or you could call him Hogan, or you could call him the Hulkster or whatever, but you couldn't just say, here's Hulk.
Hulk. Mm.
In any sort of marketing or logo or advertising, the name Hulk could not be bigger than Hogan. So either Hogan was bigger or they were the same
Equal.
size. You could not try
Mm.
to imply that it's just Hulk. Any sort of logo or color scheme that was used for Hulk Hogan could not be green or purple.
So they limited the colors specifically away from their characters' colors, right?
Exactly. So that's why red and yellow primarily became the colors of Hulk Hogan. There was
Mm.
a little bit in the mid 80s where they kind of did some blue and white stuff, but for the most part,
Yeah. I think most people, it's the red and yellow is the stereo.
yeah, like if I say Hulk Hogan, you're thinking red and yellow.
Yeah.
So as part of their payout, this is where this gets fun. Actually, there was one other clause. They could not make a Hulk Hogan comic book.
Oh, really? You
Hmm.
think they'd want to kind of cash in on that and have it kind of
Well, see,
bleed into the other, just to kind of get attention to them.
well, but that's when you're competing with Marvel, especially back in the mid '80s. Comic books were their big bread and butter, and that would have been
Right.
competition to them. They could use an image of Hulk as like in a coloring book or like a storybook or something, but you couldn't make a dedicated comic book series with him.
See, and my brain's just thinking if you sell lots of comic books, they're going to get royalties from it. So, but you're right. I mean, it is competition.
One thing he was allowed to do, because at the time in the mid '80s there was a Hulk Hogan cartoon show.
I do remember that. Oh, that triggered a memory.
Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling Connection.
Yeah.
So that was permitted because they had already been working on that prior to this deal. So as far as payout goes, because it's all about money, Marvel received 0.9% royalty on all merchandise sold. So basically, we're talking 0.9 of a penny or a
Okay.
cent.
Which doesn't seem like a lot, but
It doesn't seem like, do they have cents in Canada, right? Or
I
pennies
mean,
or
we used to have pennies. They phased it out in the last couple of years. I can't remember the actual date of when they took pennies out of circulation.
so what's like the smallest denomination of coin?
So the smallest denomination of coin now is 5 cents a nickel.
A nickel. Okay, and
Yeah.
you call them nickels?
Yeah, we call them
Oh,
nickels.
okay.
So
So
we have a queen on one side and a beaver on the other.
that's Canada. All you need is a maple
That's
leaf and a
Canada.
flag, and you'll be in business. So yeah, 0.9 of a penny doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking a lot of merchandise and
It
wrestling
adds
was
up, I'm
everywhere,
guessing.
it adds up very quickly. So, like, say out of $100, they're
Hmm.
making 90 cents. Okay,
Okay.
so you extrapolate that out. You $1,000, you're getting $9. Again, doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you start getting into millions, your
Yeah.
0.9 of a penny starts becoming thousands for basically nothing other than licensing your name. That's
Yeah.
easy money for Marvel.
Like you're not doing anything, you're just collecting the check.
Good for
It's a good
them.
deal.
Hope they had a good accountant to keep up with all that. And Marvel would receive $100 for every match that Hulk Hogan participated in.
Right. And when you're thinking how many matches he was in per week,
Oh yeah,
again, that adds up.
absolutely. Because back then they were running 300 nights a year. Sometimes doing double shots on weekends, like you'll do a
Mhm.
matinee and then you'll do somewhere else that evening. So you could easily be making, if you're Marvel, you're easily making $1,000 a week probably.
Yeah,
just
again,
from
doing nothing, just
doing just
licensing.
licensing. Right.
So I grew up with wrestling, obviously, and my brothers were big fans, and we would watch it all the time. And they had the action figures, right? Like we had the Hulk Hogan, those rubberized, like 12-inch figures. We had a few of
Mhm.
them. But I personally don't know. Did he last the 20 years contract, or did he retire out of wrestling before the 20 years?
He winds up leaving in the early 90s. He winds up leaving the WWF. He says he's going to retire. He goes off and he starts getting involved in making movies and TV shows and stuff.
Hmm.
And somewhere along the way in the 90s, and I haven't been able to pin down exactly when it was, he goes to Marvel and he negotiates his own deal and acquires the rights himself. So he owns the trademarks now to
So
Hulk
he got it
Hogan and
back.
stuff.
Okay.
So he winds up getting them, and so that's why you see him on other programming and stuff now. He is can be referred to as Hulk Hogan. Like
Okay.
back in the mid 2000s, he had the reality show Hogan
Hmm.
Knows Best and everything like that. So you can get into he can use his name for other ventures.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. So he did.
So
Okay.
yeah.
I was curious about that as soon as you brought up the 20 years. I was like, really? But I don't think he was in wrestling for 20 years.
Well, at the time when they wrote the contract, I don't think he planned to be in wrestling 20
Right.
years, but
I mean, 20 years of wrestling on your body, that's like hard on your body.
oh, yeah, and he's had like 8, 9 back surgeries or something
Oh,
over time because his big finishing move for anybody listening that doesn't know was a leg drop. So
right.
imagine
I remember that.
jumping up in the air, landing flat on your butt 300
Over
nights a
and over.
year over and over, and like that will jar your spine and your hip and everything
Oof.
all out of whack. And yeah, ugh,
Yeah, no.
that adds up over time. But
Yeah.
so did the money. So
Yeah.
good for him.
Yeah.
Well, Hulk may have been the king of wrestling. I think you have a king with a very interesting backstory to tell us
A
about.
very interesting backstory is right. So, I'm going to apologize before I even start because I am a huge Tudor buff. I have read everything about the Tudors. I've watched a lot of documentaries and shows, and it's just, I don't know, whatever it is, I'm really fascinated. So, this is a very important date in history because we're going to be looking at when King Henry the VIII ends up marrying his second wife. Now, in order to understand why it's so significant, this marriage to Anne Boleyn, who made famous in the other Boleyn Girl movie, we have to look at actually how Henry became king and his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So, divorce, killed, died, sister, killed, survived. These are all the wives of King Henry the VIII of England. King Henry was never actually supposed to be King of England, right? A lot of people forget the fact that he had an older brother. Henry's older brother, Arthur, is actually groomed for the position of king. His brother, at 2 years old, is actually betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, who is the youngest daughter of the joint Spanish sovereigns, King Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. So they had a joint kingdom and they each ruled their own kingdoms, which is that's already another fascinating story to look at. At 15, Henry's brother marries this 16-year-old Catherine, and they go off to their home in Ludlow Castle to start a very happy life together, one would assume. Although a few months later, a sweating sickness is going to sweep through the area, and they're both going to become very sick. And Catherine recovers, but Arthur, who's never really had good health, he ends up passing away. So you're like, what happens next?
What happens next?
King Henry the VII, the father of Arthur and King Henry the VIII, he's going to rule England for another 7 years until then his eventual death. During the 7 years, Henry is thrown into basically cram school to learn how to be king because he had kind of gallivanted off and done his own thing. So he's going to learn how to govern. What about Catherine?
What about Catherine?
So poor Catherine is stuck in England, right? There's a disagreement over her dowry. Her parents won't receive her back in Spain until the money is sent. And England doesn't want to pay for a princess that no longer has any ties to England. They keep her around for a little bit just to make sure if the marriage had been consummated, if she had become pregnant, then maybe there would be an heir to England, but that doesn't pan out. So she languishes basically until Henry VIII comes along and saves her, always seeing himself as a very gallant hero. He loved romanticism and knightly, courtly love.
Hence the 6 wives.
Hence the six wives, right? He's so romantic and steadfast in his love. But he takes this path, and he's very much he was a defender of the Catholic faith, and he had a lot of education in the faith and the different doctrines of the church and the Bible and all that. So he takes to heart this passage that states if a brother dies childless, then you should marry your brother's wife and bear children on his behalf. So it's in the book of Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 through 10. So Henry goes to the Pope and gets a papal dispensation granting him the ability to marry his brother's ex-wife. Catherine confesses and publicly announces that her marriage was never consummated. So she's like, it was never a done deal. Arthur had been sick. So the two go and get married on June 11th, 1509. Things are lovely. Again, we have this, you should go off and just have a wonderful start to your life. But we know that's not really going to happen. So what do you think, Mike, is the next part in our story? What are you predicting, considering we know the outcome?
Well, I'm gonna guess at some point, this marriage gets consummated.
So this marriage gets consummated right away. Almost immediately, 9 months later, Catherine has a child.
Don't waste any time there, old Henry.
Henry found Catherine to be, this great prize that he's won. So she gives
Yeah.
birth, but tragedy hits again. Catherine ends up giving birth to a stillborn daughter.
Mm.
Henry, of course, is upset, but he's like, okay, we had one child, we can try again. And he wastes no time. And a year later, Catherine gives birth to a healthy boy named Henry. Tragedy hits. 52 days after the little prince is born, he ends up passing away from unknown reasons.
So she's lost her original husband, a daughter, and a son at this point.
Oh, while also being abandoned by her parents for like 7 years.
And she's 23?
She was 23 when they got married in 09, and she
Okay.
has the little boy in 1511.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's had a pretty rough 5-year stretch here where
Yeah.
life has not turned out the way she planned.
No. As a little girl growing up in Spain, where it's nice and warm and you're a princess, and Spain was very lavish, you get sent over to England at a young age. It's cold, it's rainy, you have a sickly husband, you're abandoned, you don't have your own people or culture. She's had a hard go.
Yeah, sounds like it. Tell me it gets better.
I would like to tell you it gets better, Mike. But
She is the living embodiment of 2020 is what she is at this
she,
point.
yeah, she should just be like our symbol. And I love her because she just keeps going. She just keeps praying, and she's like, God will take care of me. God will bless us. Like, she's very positive thinking for all this tragedy. In 1513, for a third time, she becomes pregnant, and a third time she goes into premature labor and loses another baby.
Mm.
In 1514, she's going to become pregnant for a fourth time and again deliver a stillborn son. So Henry is now starting to get very concerned, right? Thankfully for Catherine, this poor woman who suffered so much hardship, she's going to conceive and finally deliver a healthy baby girl named Mary in February 18th, 1516. 2 years later, Henry is again trying, right? Okay, great, healthy baby girl, but we need that boy. 2 years later, she's going to deliver her last child, another little girl who only lives for a few hours. So, Mike, you are a king. You
Okay.
are in need of an heir. You've been married for 9 years at this point. You have one living child, a female,
Mm-hmm. Right. Who cannot be king.
who cannot be king, right?
Right.
Who will divide your power amongst whatever king she ends up marrying or prince she ends up marrying. The best doctors in your whole country are basically telling you that your wife is no longer able to bear children. What's going on in your head?
The way I would approach it and the way he would approach it are probably two different approaches, but I'm also not actually a king, and this is not the 1500s, and we know a lot. We have a lot more technology and whatnot available to us now. But at the time, if I'm having to put myself under his crown, I would say you maybe have to consider alternative options because, unfortunately, the wife of whom he is with is not capable of giving him the said offspring required for kingship.
That's right, right? There is options. I mean, the law about allowing a female issue to become the ruling monarch actually didn't change until Prince William and Princess Catherine had their first child. Of course, the child was born, Prince George, but
Mhm.
That actually wasn't changed until they were about to deliver because they wanted to make sure whether if they had a female child, it could still just become the ruling monarch.
So that literally just changed within the last 10 years.
Decade. Yeah.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the other option is Henry VIII did have sisters who were married and had male issue. So you could allow your nephew to take the crown.
Okay.
The real thing is Henry VII, Henry's father coming into his power, had to go through a great war. So there was a lot of instability and people didn't want that to happen again. So this is kind of where Henry VIII's obsession about a stable heir to succeed him kind of came into play. So in 1520, we have the lovely Anne Boleyn and her sister are going to show up on the scene. Henry has a little dalliance with Mary, the famous other Boleyn girl.
Dalliance.
Right, a
That's a good word
dalliance,
for it. A little
right?
dalliance.
To be a little proper. She actually conceives a son for him. Anne, however, is the one that Henry is totally over the moon for. He's greatly attracted to her. She's totally refusing all of his advances. Anne did not want to become a mistress to the king. She saw what happened to other mistresses. She's in love with another courtier. But Henry found this refusal extremely enticing, right? Remember, he's the king. He's given whatever he wants. So he just finds this super attractive. And she's kind of like, get away from me. Eventually, pressured by the king and her family, who sees this as a great stepping stone to get more power, she is kind of trapped in a relationship with him. So there's this flirtation going on, and she holds off his sexual advances for a very long time. She came up with all kinds of ways of keeping him, I guess, interested, but not actually becoming a mistress. She was educated in the French court, which was renowned for their flirtations and other wily charms.
Yeah, that's
That's one way of putting it.
that's a good way of putting it. We'll just leave it there and we'll let you move on.
So what's going on with Catherine while Henry's having this like flirtation with the Boleyns and Henry devises a plan to divorce his wife. There had been divorces granted by the Pope to other monarchs, so there was a precedent.
Mm-hmm.
The Pope, though, refuses to grant him an annulment, right? The fact that he's basically being held prisoner by Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, may have had something to do with it,
Maybe. I could see where he
right?
goes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what is he to do? Well, he goes to Catherine and basically is like, look, you're so pious and generous and faith-filled. Why don't you just excuse yourself from our marriage and take yourself to a nunnery and live the religious life, right? Take up religious orders. And Catherine goes, no, I am your true wife. I am the Queen of England. Not going to happen. We have this daughter. Let's just be happy that God's blessed us and make her the best ruling monarch that we can whenever she gets married. And Henry's not game for that. The Pope's not granting him a divorce. So Henry gets another idea. He gets very clever. He's like, I'll just make myself the head of the English church and I'll grant myself a divorce.
Well, that's one way to get around it.
So with this in mind, on January 25th, which brings us to our date in question, 1533, Henry VIII marries Anne Boleyn. And the desire for Henry to have a male heir is going to change the world forever, of course, as England breaks from the Catholic Church. And then for decades, the country of England is going to be thrown into basically civil strife with Catholics and Protestants trying to play a successor of their faith on the throne. During all those years of trying to obtain a divorce and keeping the king advances at bay, they are rewarded with what?
Another girl.
Another girl, right? Elizabeth I is born, and she's actually going to go on to be usher in the golden age of English history. But at the time, Henry's just like, great, another girl, right? Anne is then sadly going to go on to miscarriage 3 more times. By 1536, Catherine of Aragon dies. She's alone. She's exiled. Henry had forbidden her from being with any of her friends, from her daughter visiting her. It was actually quite awful and does not have the same soothing ability that Catherine had to ease kind of Henry's temper tantrums. So Henry's already eyeing up another wife,
Of
Jane
course he
Seymour.
is.
Yeah. So although they get married on this date, January 25th, Anne is not going to be on the scene for much longer. Henry's actually going to lay charges of adultery against her. He claims that she is going to have slept with 5 other men, her brother being one of them. She's found guilty and executed May 19th. So just a few months later, she's executed by a French swordsman. With his first wife dead, his second wife executed, Henry is like, hey, I'm actually a free man according to the laws of the church. He marries Jane a mere 11 days later.
Well, at least he took, some time to properly grieve. It's not like he married her the next day.
Poor Jane Seymour having to go through that, right? Jane is going to go on to have that long awaited son that Henry desires, but it's going to cost her life as she passes away 12 days after the birth. And then what about the other women that we mentioned at the beginning? Well, after Jane dies, Henry's going to marry Anne of Cleves, a German Protestant, to form an alliance. He doesn't like her. He claims she's gross. So he's going to declare her his sister and just move on. He's just like, you're now my sister. She actually makes out the best of all the wives. She gets money and doesn't have to be married to him, who at this point is quite large. He has a disgusting sore on his leg that won't heal. He's smelly. It's not great. He then goes on to marry a very young girl, Catherine Howard, who's 19, marrying his 50-year-old self. She's actually going to have an affair with a groom and is executed. She isn't treated as nicely as Anne with the French swordsman. She just has her head chopped off with an axe on the block.
Ooh.
Yeah. And she's an interesting character. We'll have to get into that another time. And lastly, he marries Catherine Parr. And she's going to go on to outlive Henry and get remarried, only to also die following childbirth. Out of all of this, the date of January 25th, 1533 is so important because, of course, it just brings in all this political and religious strife into Europe. And it's going to go back and forth. When Henry dies, they're actually going to put Catherine's daughter Mary on the throne, and she's going to bring Catholicism back to England. She's going to go on to die, and Queen Elizabeth I is going to take over and bring back Protestantism into England.
British history is very. I know we say the word interesting a lot on this show, but just with the bit that we got into with King Henry the VIII and the whole other side branches of that story we could have
Ugh.
gotten into with some of the other wives. I mean, it's very interesting is the only way to describe it.
And complicated. And you're like, yes, today's the
Yes.
day he married his second wife, and it's interesting. But once you realize the historical and religious impacts of just this one date, it's so important.
Yeah. I have a feeling we will revisit the
Yeah.
royal monarchy at some point later in the year.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole thing is just so interesting, right? You think of this king and how does he get six wives? And it's just a very weird and fascinating part of British history.
It is. And January 25th was an important day, as you said, in British history. It was also an important day, really, in mankind history, because on January
Yes.
25th, Alexander Graham Bell in 1915 made the first transcontinental phone call. He called and talked to a friend of his in San Francisco.
Which, if you think about it, like I still don't even really know how phones work. Like the fact that in the 1800s he's able to just do this, it's like, okay. Like I get how phones work, but you don't, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
mind-boggling when you think about
Like,
technology and how it all works.
yeah, well, and especially nowadays when you get into cell phones or even, video chatting and whatnot. But
Yeah.
even to just go back to the 80s or something, you pick up a phone, you punch in a number, okay, you figure this somehow it goes through this wire that goes to another wire that goes to another
Yeah.
wire. Eventually, it winds up at the other end of the phone to the person I'm speaking to.
What's funny is, I mean, and even just looking at how we're communicating right now, like it's
Yeah.
mind-boggling, right?
Oh, for
But
sure.
my mom is old enough where she was actually a telephone operator where she would have to like connect the different lines. And in Nova Scotia, you have a lot of people with the same last name. So you have a lot of like Angus Beatons or Angus McDonald, like, McDonald's and McDougall's and all those kinds of Scottish names. And in order to tell each other apart, you end up having nicknames. So when I
Hmm.
go home to Nova Scotia and I go to Cape Breton Island and someone asks me like, who are you? I say, oh, I'm Sally Central's granddaughter. Sally Central's not her last name. Her last name's Beaton or was Beaton. But my grandfather, his home growing up was the Central telephone station where you would
Hmm.
call Central to get connected.
And the switchboard operator plugs the line into the extension for you. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So she got the name by marrying him. And so when I go home, that's what I tell people who I am. Like I don't even use my real last name.
At least it keeps you somewhat anonymous when you're back home.
Right. And there's a connection with Alexander Graham Bell because he had a home on Cape Breton Island on Ben Brian.
And that's not the only Canadian connection to Mr.
Right.
Bell's life, because he was born over in Europe and winds up moving to Canada, as you just mentioned, and
Mhm.
ultimately winds up in America. He was actually just born as Alexander Bell. He did not have a middle name. And for his 10th birthday, he asked his dad if he could get a middle name because his older brothers had middle names, but now why he didn't is beyond me. So for his 11th birthday, his dad allowed him to get a middle name, and he chose Graham for a gentleman by the name of Alexander Graham, who was a Canadian that Bell's father treated, because Bell's father, his grandfather, and his brother all were involved in speech therapy and oration and stuff because Bell's mother and Bell's wife were deaf.
Interesting. I did not know that fact about the middle name.
Yeah, so communication obviously was a central part of Bell's life,
Mhm.
and that led him ultimately to invent the telephone. Now, there's a sidebar to that, to where there's some people who believe that Elisha Gray should be credited with inventing the telephone because there's issues with when patents were filed and the technology and the
Oh,
diagram and stuff. But we'll get into that.
but Bell is the one that's, officially credited. Interesting.
Right, and he was the one who co-founded the American Telephone and Telegraph Company in
Mhm.
1885, which we of course now know as AT&T, which in and of itself has a whole history of mergers and acquisitions and what have you that is a
Yeah, speaking of
unique.
going off on a sub story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Much like telephone lines go off on different extensions. This story can go many different ways.
So the phone was actually designed to be an assistive piece of technology,
Yes, it
right?
was designed to be, a communication aid.
Fascinating.
I believe you have another invention.
Well, if we're going to continue on this stream of, inventions that are for the betterment of mankind and looking at issues that people have, we have a big date now in regards to diabetes and insulin. So diabetes is something that's really close to home for me. My mom actually has diabetes and she developed it through each of her pregnancies. So you can develop diabetes gestationally.
Gestational
Um,
diabetes. Yep.
yeah, and she reverted after my brothers, but after me, she never did, and so I always feel guilty, and I just tell her I was too sweet for her, and I'm sorry, right?
Aw, I like that.
So it's like,
Sh-
sorry,
shout out,
mom.
shout out to Trisha's mom who listens
Yeah,
every week. Thank you for listening.
he listens every week from Nova Scotia. Yeah, I love you, mom. Um, so I'm sorry that I gave you diabetes and that you've, now have to have insulin. But hey, we're glad that insulin is created. So of course, diabetes is when your pancreas no longer functions properly and you don't develop the right amount of insulin to regulate your blood sugar.
Right.
And Dr. Frederick Banting, who is going to develop the insulin that we can actually use, is a big hero for me. He's born near Alliston, Ontario in 1891. He grew up, made it into the medical program at the University of Toronto in 1912. He's going to go on to enlist in the Army during World War One. And upon his return after the war, he becomes a resident surgeon at the hospital for sick children in Toronto between the years 1920 or 1919 and 1920. And it's during this time that he comes up with this idea of extracting insulin from the pancreas of other animals and using it for human consumption. So he's going to work for 9 months experimenting on how to successfully do this. And he and his assistant, Charles Best, are going to prepare pancreatic extractions to prolong the lives of diabetes in dogs. So they basically make a dog diabetic and then use this insulin that they've taken to see if they can correct the diabetes in the dog, which was a success. It sounds, awful nowadays. I'm sure PETA would not approve.
No, they would not. But that was back then, right?
Yeah. So I'm sure they treated the dog very humanely otherwise. But, for people who care about animals, it can be a little, you know, uh. But they're going to get some aid from another professor at the University of Toronto, Professor John McLeod. And the crude insulin extract was then purified for human testing by James Colip. So these four men are all working together to develop this process for human use. And on January 23rd, 1922, the first successful test on a human patient with diabetes occurred when insulin's going to be administered to a very, very dangerously ill boy named Leonard Thompson. So before the invention of insulin, you would have entire wards of hospitals just set up with patients who had diabetes, and many of them would be children that had juvenile diabetes. And you would basically fall into a diabetic coma. You'd be asleep, and you would just have parents of these children or, significant others of these patients just sitting there watching their loved one pass away. It was very eerie and awful, right? Just to never wake up from this diabetic coma. So Leonard's one of these boys, and once he's given the insulin injection, he wakes up and he begins to recover, and he's able to successfully be treated with this insulin. And then Banting and McLeod are actually going to go on to jointly win a Nobel Peace Prize for medicine in 1923. So out of the four gentlemen that worked on this experiment, Banting and McLeod's are the ones that are credited with doing the most.
Good, and we're thankful for
Super thankful.
yeah.
Now you have all kinds of, you have long-acting insulin and short-acting insulin. You can have insulin pumps. There's lots of different ways for individuals to get the medicine that they need.
Yeah, that's a great thing. There are,
Yeah.
diabetes is obviously an issue that we have, here in America and Canada as well. And without having a way to inject insulin into people, it is a very effective method in helping to regulate diabetes.
Yep. I think it's one of the fastest growing medical concerns in both of our countries.
I think so. I don't know the numbers at all
Yeah.
on this, so I wouldn't
I'd have to
begin
double
to
check the stats.
estimate. But yeah, it's certainly is a disease that is on the rise. That
Hmm.
is for sure. Well, we are certainly thankful for their invention because insulin has saved and made a lot of diabetics' lives a lot easier to manage and control their diabetes. And that is something we're certainly thankful for. Another thing we are thankful for, because this story could have had a much different ending,
Mm.
was the January 24th B-52 crash in Goldsboro, North Carolina. Shortly before midnight, a Boeing B-52 was on a test flight, and it was carrying a couple of 3 to 4 megaton nuclear bombs on board when the plane broke up in midair.
That's a terrifying scenario.
That is a very terrifying scenario. They were attempting to refuel in air. And when the tanker plane tried to connect, he said, "Hey, you've got a fuel leak out the wing." And they're like, "Oh, this is not good." So if the tanker fails, they're like, "We're not going to connect to you." And so they were assuming a holding position to kind of burn off some of this fuel before they tried to land back at the Air Force
Mhm.
Base nearby. The leak continued to get worse and worse. And at one point, it had lost 37,000 pounds of fuel in about 3 minutes.
Holy moly. That's not
So
just a leak.
yeah, that's a big problem. So they attempted to return back to the base and they lose control because they can't keep the plane stable because it's just literally starting to fall apart. So the pilot orders the crew to eject, 5 of which survive either through ejecting or escaping after the crash. Unfortunately, one did not survive his parachute landing and 2 died in the crash.
Oh,
So
no.
that's the unfortunate part of this story. The good part and the thankful part is, what about those 2 nuclear bombs on board? Because that's a big
Right.
problem. That's like not going to be good. So, one bomb was actually found completely intact.
Wow.
When its parachute deployed, the parachute got caught in the tree.
And so the tree actually created like a buffer, like
Yeah, it basically
stopped it from,
stopped it from hitting the ground and detonating.
wow.
However, at the time, the Pentagon said there was no chance of an explosion, and a Department of Defense spokesperson said the bomb was unarmed and could not explode. However, in 2013, a Freedom of Information Act request confirmed that a single switch out of 4 on the bomb that did not fire was what prevented that bomb from detonating.
Oh my goodness.
So
That's
even though the
intense.
the tree caught the bomb, basically, it still was this close to detonating.
Now, do we know why this plane was carrying two nuclear bombs? Like
The only I don't I would imagine this was just a training mission that they
training?
were doing because
Oh
we're
man.
talking 1961, so
Cold War.
Cold War is still a thing. That's the only thing I can figure
Wow.
because the Air Force Base was nearby in Goldsboro, North Carolina. So it
Mm,
was fairly close to its base. So I would just figure this was probably a training mission
right.
with live bombs on board. So that's one bomb.
Okay, what about the other one?
What about the other one? Yeah, that's a real good question. So the second bomb crashed into a muddy field at about 700 miles an hour,
Oh my
which
goodness.
is about 1100 kilometers an hour for our metric friends.
That's
Uh,
fast.
but it did not detonate. Which surprised me because you would think something going that fast
Mm,
just instinct. The only thing I could figure is because it was a muddy field and it had
that
so much
absorbed the impact.
force that it absorbed the impact and drove it down.
Wow.
So the tail of the bomb was actually found about 20 feet below ground,
Whoa.
which kind of backs up the theory of it's coming in so fast it landed in soft ground and it went just penetrated through it. Due to groundwater flooding in the area, so like when you get deep enough, there's too much water in the soil.
Mhm.
They were not able to excavate the entire bomb. Now they were able to remove part of it, but there's part of it still there. It's not the part that's going to explode. They were able to get that part out, but like the part of a bomb that
Like the
fires that
casing?
right that trips to make the bomb begin to go off is still actually in the ground. And so there's an easement that doesn't allow anyone to get into that area. Um,
Oh, so they
yeah.
have it protected, but
Mhm.
wow.
They worked out a deal with the owner of the land where this
Mhm.
fell, and no current or future landowner can dig or drill any deeper than 5 feet, nor can that area, that 200-foot area around this site, be used for anything other than growing crops, timber, or pasture.
Nice, safe land use.
Yes. Had the bomb exploded,
Oh gosh.
each bomb, each bomb was capable of releasing 250 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb and would have created a 100% kill zone within an 8.5 mile radius.
Wow. Like my brain's going to, of course, the historical footage of the Hiroshima
Hmm.
bombings. You would think for a training mission that may, if you're going to use live weapons, right? Because I'm assuming there's a purpose to using live weapons for training.
Right.
But you'd think you'd use a nuclear bomb with just like a smaller, you know,
Yeah.
megaton detonation happening just in case.
Or even just some sort of like small test bomb or something. Yeah, I'm totally with you
Yeah.
on that because that's
Like why
that's
are you testing bombs that are bigger than the ones you dropped on another nation?
just gone.
Wow, super thankful for that.
Yes.
And I have another thankful story involving a nuclear item. It's not a bomb, but it's a
That's
nuclear
good.
powered satellite. So, just like the United States, Canada has a few territories, if you don't know, right? Do you know how many territories we have, Mike?
Well, like I know you have like Yukon territory.
Hmm.
Um, I'm thinking there's somewhere up like Prince Edward Island. Is there like some maybe outskirt land islands or somewhere maybe up there? I don't know. I'll say five.
Well, kind of close, right?
Okay.
You guys have five.
Hmm.
I looked it up. So you beat us 5-3. We have three
Okay.
territories. All three are located in the northwest, like up
Okay. Up so up
in the
like near
north.
Yukon
Yeah.
territory. Okay. All right.
So we have the Yukon, which you mentioned. We
Mhm.
have the Northwest Territories, and then we have
Yes.
Nunavut.
Okay. That one I hadn't heard of.
Well, Nunavut's our newest one. It was created April 1st, 1999.
Oh,
Um,
so it's fairly recent in
yeah,
relative terms. Okay.
in relative history, it was part of the Northwest Territories, and then there was a land disagreement involving the Indigenous people, and it ceded and created its own territory.
Gotcha.
So, where this story takes place now would be considered Nunavut, but at the time it was the Northwest Territories. January 24th, 1978, we have a Soviet nuclear powered surveillance satellite called the Cosmos 954, and it crashes in Canada's north. Um, right where I said nowadays we would say in Nunavut, but historical records will say the Northwest Territories because at the time that's where it was. On the date in question, NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which is a joint task force between our two countries.
Yes, and that's who tracks Santa Claus every
They
Christmas
do
Eve.
track Santa every Christmas Eve. We have NORAD's broadcast on CBC Radio,
Oh,
so you can
nice.
listen and follow Santa along. Now, NORAD ends up tracking this huge fireball that's streaking across the sky, and the Soviet satellite
That was not Santa
crashed.
Claus.
That was not Santa Claus, no, and that's not something you want to be tracking anytime on your screen, right?
No, it's not.
It's going to crash near Great Slave Lake, and it's going to scatter an enormous amount of radioactivity over 124 square kilometers, stretching down into northern Alberta and over into northern Saskatchewan as well. So it didn't just affect the Northwest Territories, it's affecting my now adoptive province of Alberta. In Ottawa, there are urgent questions coming from Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who is the current Prime Minister's father. So Justin Trudeau's father. And he's wondering, why wasn't there more warning? Did the Americans know something and they were holding back on their end of NORAD? Who's cleaning up this giant mess, right? It's affecting a large area of our territory and affecting the people that live there. So this satellite was actually a maritime satellite to help with navigation. And it's launched on September 18th, 1977. NORAD computers right away noticed that there's a decay in the orbit. The Soviets aren't really given much information. It's powered by a tiny nuclear reactor. Because of the radiation risk, the Soviets soon admit that the satellite's out of control, but that's all the details they give our governments. And the satellite was designed to eject its reactor core in a higher orbit in case of an emergency, but this feature failed to do its job. And so when the satellite crashes, it still has the
It's full
radioactive.
payload on board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So once the crash occurs, our two countries end up having a joint cleanup effort called Operation Morning Light, and it's going to run until October 1978. So, want to guess how much of the radioactive power source was recovered?
Half?
Oh, I wish I could say that it was half.
Oh,
It's
it's way less.
much lower. Only 0.1% actually. So that's a big problem.
That's 99.9% that did not get recovered.
Yeah. Canada's gonna, ask, of course, because we're so nice, we're too polite.
Yes.
We don't demand anything of the Soviet Union. We ask politely that they pay us an estimated $15 million, which is now the equivalent of just over 599 million if we were going to calculate for inflation. The Soviets are only going to pay about 3 million. They're like, take it or leave it.
Best I could do is 3 million.
Best I can do is 3 million. We're going to go to Pawn Stars.
Yeah, exactly.
The crash and cleanup's going to cause international policy questions about the use of radioactive materials in space. The United States is going to request that countries prohibit satellites containing radioactive material from orbiting the Earth. This is going to be followed by Canada and other countries in Europe. In November 1978, the United Nations is going to authorize its Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space to set up a working group to study nuclear-powered satellites. Despite this commitment and this committee being set up and policies being adjusted over the years for NPS, nuclear power sources in space, we have no legally binding policies at the moment. So that's really comforting.
So somebody could, in theory, if they wanted to, put
Yep.
one of these in orbit.
Yeah, they have stated when I looked on the United Nations website that you can use nuclear power sources to get to other planets. So, of course, as we go and explore Mars and things like that, the ability to have nuclear power sources on those spacecrafts is feasible. And they're talking about spacecrafts going to the moon, satellites or craft that are orbiting the Earth itself. There's actually no legally binding law or policy that states they can't use nuclear power sources.
Yeah, you'd almost have to for something like Mars or whatever, I would think. I mean, I know we have like the Mars rover there now,
Mm.
but I could see the benefits of using a nuclear powered ship of some
Right.
kind to get to these further destinations to
Absolutely.
Jupiter or Saturn or something like that, or Pluto if it's a planet this year. Because I don't know, they flip
They
flop on
change.
that. I don't. Poor Pluto. I mean, we love you, Pluto. If you're listening to us on Pluto, follow us on Instagram at Time Machine with Trish and Mike. We'd love to hear from you.
Pluto's always a planet in my heart.
Yes, I grew up with it being a planet, so it's a planet to me.
Yep.
I'm just
No one
saying.
can take it away.
I don't
But
care
yeah.
what NASA says. Pluto's a planet. It's
Uh,
also Mickey's favorite dog.
True. So, there's that.
Yes. Yes, there is that. One other thing we do have anniversary wise coming up that's not really a
Not
pleasant one
pleasant.
uh, to mention is, and it's more so one of these, it's hard to believe this has been a year, but on January 26th, just after 9 a.m., there was a infamous helicopter crash in Calabasas, California that unfortunately claimed the life of Kobe Bryant, his daughter, and 6 other passengers, as well as the pilot.
Yeah, isn't that hard to believe that it was just a year ago? It's
It
really, really
is.
hard.
Like, in some ways, it seems like it was 6 months ago, and in some ways, it seems like it was 6 years ago because of everything that happened in 2020. And obviously, the sports world and really America, and I would imagine Canada as well,
Mhm.
was just in shock because of this. And
Yeah, anytime you have someone who's just very influential, right? Significant in sports history, or just it's not
pop
only just that
culture,
he was a famous
yeah,
person in pop culture, but like the idea that it's a father and a daughter, just so tragic at the beginning of a year that held so much potential, right?
yeah,
That's what I think is the
absolutely,
most.
yeah. And crazy as that was, and as surreal as that was, we had no idea what the rest of
That
2020
was
was
just the
going to
tip of
bring
the
us.
iceberg.
Right? That was the appetizer, if you
Yeah.
will, to a very interesting year. And as we go through this first season of the Time Machine with Trish and Mike, w- we're gonna come across some fun anniversaries from 2020 that are gonna be um, interesting. I think will
It'll be
probably be a
jarring. It'll be like, "Hey, remember
yeah,
when?"
yeah.
Right?
Like at this point a year ago, COVID is starting to become a thing. It's not really a major
Yes.
issue here yet in America. I don't
No.
believe it was yet in Canada.
For me, the only reason it was more significant is my brother works for the Canadian government and is living over in China. And so we were getting reports that he and his wife were going to be, and a bunch of the other officials were going to be evacuated out. So for us, it was like, oh, okay. But it was still contained to China. It wasn't this
The
big thing.
global issue
Yeah.
that it would go on to become. Yeah, it's just crazy. We're at this point a year ago. We're still all going about our lives as normal.
Yeah.
We're not. In fact, the day that Kobe's accident happened, I was at Disney.
Right.
I was out there with my friend Sammy, and we were about to walk in to take this is honest truth. We were going into the building to go take a picture with Mickey Mouse when I
Oh,
got the alert on my phone that that Kobe had passed away in the accident. At that point, we didn't know who else was on the helicopter.
right.
It took a little while for some of the details to come out,
Well, I'm
but
really thankful that, I mean, it could have been so much worse, like if they had crashed somewhere more populated. You know what I
or
mean?
crashed into a home or something,
Right. Yeah.
because well, unfortunately we've seen stuff like that happen. Sometimes
Yeah.
with planes or helicopters crashing into residential areas. Yeah, in fact, speaking of
Yeah.
B-52s crashing here in Orlando by the airport, because the Orlando International Airport was originally McCoy Air Force Base, which is why the airport code for Orlando is MCO. Like you would think it would be like ORL or something like that, and it's
Right.
MCO because of McCoy Air Force Base, because that was the base there. And there's an area not too far that's a little bit north of the airport where a B-52 back in the 70s crashed into a neighborhood and unfortunately did kill a few people, as well as
That's
people
crazy.
on board.
Aw.
Yeah.
See, and those things are just so like you just think of like one moment or like one directional change and like where could it have landed, you know?
Yeah, for
History's full of
sure.
what ifs.
History is full of what ifs and a lot more interesting things to come on
Yeah.
the time machine.
Well, and the
I
one we can end on a nice note because it's also the
Yeah,
anniversary, right,
let's
of
do
a
that
very
because
famous space vehicle
true, involving time travel at that.
involving time travel. I mean, we tried to secure the rights and all, but it was too expensive.
Yes, yeah, we could not get the infamous vehicle used for time travel in a three-part cinematic adventure starring Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd.
Yep. which is the dun 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 dun.
Do
Oh,
we
I
have
thought
the
you were
rights?
doing.
I do not want to anger the incur the wrath of the DeLorean Motor Company. Oops, did we say the
Oh,
name? We
did you say
said the
it out
name.
loud? We gave
I think
credit.
I did. Ah, the
Yeah. January
yeah,
21st, 1981. It's going to go into production in Dunmurry, Northern Ireland, UK.
and becomes infamous just really a few years later because Back to the Future, the
Right.
first one came out in '85, right?
I thought it was 85.
80, I believe it's '85.
Let me see. I'll do a quick googly Google. Yeah, 85. You were right. Right on the money.
Okay, well, I think that's about going to do it on this adventure of the Time
Yeah.
Machine. We thank you for listening. And we thank you for making it to the end of the episode. And if you didn't, well, I hope that when you go to change the channel next time, the batteries in your remote control are dead.
Oh, evil Mike. Dastardly evil.
Get up and change the channel and get batteries. Oh, wait, you forgot to buy some at the store. Now, now what you gonna do? Maybe you're gonna make it to the end of our episode next time, and good things will
Yeah.
happen to you.
Because you're going to drive to that store and your car is going to be on empty.
Oh,
Oof.
but they can listen to our show while they're wait for gas.
Very true. And learn their lesson.
Yes, do that. All right. On
So
that
don't
note,
forget to like and subscribe, guys. You can find us also on Instagram and let us know questions, concerns, queries, or freakouts, as I tell my students.
that is a excellent verbiage on which you have just unleashed upon us. Thank you for that. Follow us on Instagram at Time Machine with Trish and Mike, and make sure, as Trish said, subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. That would be really appreciated by us. It helps
Yes.
us. You know, we're still
Yep.
a new show. It's still growing. We thank you for listening. But if you leave a review, you know, hopefully 5 stars, maybe. You know, it would be nice. I'll take 4. 5 is better. Let's the podcast companies know, hey, this show's kind of cool. Maybe people might listen to it, and it kind of gets it out there into the universe so
Yep.
people can listen to us on Pluto.
Exactly.
All right. With that being said, have a great week, and we'll see you next week here on the Time Machine.